we are down to one more album that's left to have to resonate with all of us, guys.
Yes.
And that is the Rolling Stones' Some Girls. Matt, why don't you run the numbers, and then I'll take us off on this.
Some Girls by the Rolling Stones comes in at number 120 on Best Ever Albums in the 1970s, number 7 in 1978, number 512 of all time, and it is not on Rolling Stone's top 500 list. In Best Ever Albums, it is their 6th highest rated album. And I'm not sure, is this the last time? Are we covering Tattoo You or anything else, John, in a cold listen?
This is our last Rolling Stones
album.
album.
Oh, wow. Man. This is a big moment here.
Yeah, man. Well, this is a big moment because this album kicks ass. So I wanna put on three things that I put on right off the bat. Number one is that the Rolling Stones still sound cool in 1978, which is key because there was a period where I joke often about when the Rolling Stones kept going, it's like, dude, how long are we going to try to pretend to be cool? We're not cool anymore. Mm-hmm. They are still cool in 1978. Let me start by saying that because this album is very cool. That's number one. Number two, there are a few bands that elicit when they're running right a more visceral reaction in me than the Rolling Stones because there's just certain songs on this that hit me in the innards, guys, and the loins, maybe even at times, that undefinable things that make the Stones, and it's just really cool to continue to see the Stones be able to do that as they're, I think, right at 40 years old when they're doing this album. So that's number two. And number three is, as I listen to this album lyrically and even thematically, right, I thought to myself, boy, you couldn't release an album like this in 2022 anymore.
No? You don't think so?
Just even in Miss You, which is just such an awesome song. It's a top 5 Stones song for me ever. But that there was stuff like, there's some Puerto Rican girls just trying to meet, just the small things that I think only Mick Jagger can get away with. But even with Mick Jagger, there's still things he says on this album that you just can't get away with lyrically. But I think it's just, it's of its time.
One comes to mind in particular.
Yeah, well, yes, yeah, for sure. But Some Girls, I think, is a theme of this album because this is about, I guess, the Stones at 40 sort of being more contemplative with their relationships as opposed to later. I think that's what this is supposed to.
I can't believe they're 40 on this album.
Yeah,
I don't know if they were quite 40. I think they were more in their mid 30s, but still, it was they were.
Well, I mean, it's. So, okay, so I have to, so let's take a look. Let's test this. So this album was released in 1978. Mick Jagger was born in 1943. So they're 35. You're right, Matt. So he's 35. Keith Richards is also 43, so he's okay. So they're in their mid 30s. So okay, I was dating them a little bit. Sorry about that, guys.
But in rock and roll, I mean, might, if you're 35, you might as well be 92, right?
Right.
Yeah,
which is I think what the Stones are now.
Especially in the 70s, though. You know what I mean? Before rock and roll really, aged.
Yeah.
And there wasn't a nostalgia market yet. You know what I mean? It was still very much a youth.
Yep.
Yeah.
This is their 14th British album and 16th American album.
Yeah. They're dinosaurs in 1978 for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, it's funny to have them thrown into this sea, by the way, of AOR and punk and disco and all of these things we're listening to, and then all of a sudden the Stones come back in just out of nowhere, throwing this album out there. But yeah, it's I hate to make it sound this cliche, but let's go into the basics. It's Mick Jagger's swagger all over. When you're singing about some girls, right? Just some girls we know or dated or screwed or any version of how you could know some girls, right? That's kind of what the theme of this is. So, and there's nobody better to sing about that than, Mick Jagger, because, he has a weird thing where he can go from being lecherous to oddly deep, on different songs. And Keith Richards is sort of like that with his guitar as well. He can go to grimy and dirty and then go more into contemplative or almost sorrowful. This album has Ron Wood on it, right? And you could definitely tell tone wise because now we've seen Brian Jones, we've seen it was Mick Taylor, right? On that one, and now we've got, I think, Ron Wood, right, is now on here. And there definitely is a different sound. Each of them have a slightly different sound that marks the era that they're in, right?
It's the first time Ronnie Wood's on a full
Yeah,
time member.
and like,
since.
and would you say like Ron Wood's guitar? I'd say I don't want to say it's like more danceable, kind of, but it has a little bit more of that groove, which fits really well in the era. If that makes sense. Like it's kind of, I don't know. He like kind of takes the Stones into what they needed to sound like in the late 70s. Would be the best way I would describe it. Playing style wise, like I don't know. Maybe when you guys talk about it, I'll be able to find the words for what's different between his sound with the Stones and the others. But he fits in very nicely. But this was such a welcome addition to both this week and the late 70s right now, because it's always nice to have the Stones just reassert themselves as being one of the best rock bands of all time. And it's easy to forget that. And once again, I said it before, I think as omnipresent as the Stones are for one generation, I almost feel like in like younger generations, they kind of just exist, but not with the realization of like how important they were. And when you hear albums like this, you just sort of say there just aren't a lot of people that can put it together like the Stones do,
Right.
to be this accessible and this blues driven, but also this hard hitting. So yeah, strong recommend for me. Love this album.
Yeah, I'm kind of sad we're coming to the end of the Rolling Stones on this list. But that's what's this podcast. That's what's happened, right? We got there with the Who, we got there with the Beatles and Zeppelin and stuff, and now we're doing Rolling Stones. And I've always had I don't think I ever talked about this, but initially when I was a kid, I did not care for the Rolling Stones at all. And my knowledge base of the Rolling Stones was CDs that my parents had, even though my mom had she had like Let It Bleed and she had Sticky Fingers on LP, but we never listened to record, so by the time they got the CDs of like Steel Wheels and Voodoo Lounge, I was just like, it's like I didn't really get all that into it, and then it wasn't later until I was in college probably that I got Sticky Fingers and started like getting more into them and stuff and really seeing how great that they are. This was a really great listen for me because I did not know this record. I knew Miss You and I knew some girls.
Really?
Or not some girls. I knew Miss You and I knew Beast of Burden, right? So I didn't know this record. I kind of thought that, the narrative in my head was that the Rolling Stones did this output in the 70s, which kind of culminated with Exile and Main Street. And then they just started to kind of get into their late 70s, 80s period where they started to fall off. So that narrative in my head was incorrect because this album is awesome. I agree with John. This is a fantastic record. And this is just stripped down. For the most part, this is just great classic Stones blues rock. They do throw other elements in there, like they got a little bit of the funk dance thing going on with Miss You and Beasts of Burden. It's
Punk
kind of
Shattered a little bit.
Yeah, and it makes sense that those songs were the singles in this time period, right? Because the majority of the album doesn't sound like those songs. I would say that it's the rest of the album is more of a straight up rock album with some elements of country. They did with Faraway Eyes. That's their kind of Dead Flowers of this record, if you will.
But with Mick with that southern accent.
Yeah.
Yeah, and he does that, and he's like telling a story. He's not even really singing, so he's almost like acting. And then you've got Some Girls, which kind of that's a little bit of an Americana sound to it. So it makes sense that those songs in the late 70s, when disco and more new wave were kind of the popular things, that the songs that kind of stand out as being a little bit different and off the normal path for them are the ones that become, the ones that they release as singles. So I like the harmonica in here. There's got there's a number of songs here where the harmonica comes a little bit more prominent. I don't.
That's
recall
Ron Wood, I think.
Is that Ron Wood? Because that makes sense. Because I'm like, I don't remember hearing a whole lot of harmonica in previous Stone stuff. So and I like the sound of that. I love I like their cover of Just My Imagination. The Temptation song. It's not like Debo's version of I Can't Get No Satisfaction. That's totally different. I mean, it's the song, right? But they do it instead of like a, kind of like a, an R&B type ballad. This is more, this is just a rock song. They just put the guitars on it and slather that around, and you get this cover. So it's upbeat and fun, And then, that line in Some Girls, I think I had heard that before.
Which one? Because he basically disparages every group in the world. Yeah.
Yeah, the most vulgar one when he's just discussing, his reasons for loving African American women. Let's put it that way, right?
Well, he's in many ways just as offensive with Chinese girls and English girls who I believe he says he doesn't want to talk to them ever, so he takes the phone off the hook and have them never call.
Yeah, but that doesn't. As a non-lyrics guy, there's certain words that just kind of come to.
Oh, gotcha.
Yeah,
okay.
And that's like, oh, I just caught that, So yeah. And then I had to read a little bit about that. That sparked an incident with Jesse Jackson, who. I'm not saying I didn't catch on to. I kind of had an idea, but when you say that these girls just want to F all night and he doesn't have enough jam, I'm just like, okay,
Some girls, they're so pure. Some girls so corrupt. Some girls give me children. I only made love to her once. That was my favorite. That's my favorite. So while there were higher end things that caught your attention, there also are equally as alarming things. You know what I mean? Buried in what you didn't get.
Just a little. Yeah, exactly. So, but as far as the music goes, this is fantastic. So,
in fairness, they kind of told you on Under My Thumb, and Stupid Girl, and other songs we've covered. Yeah.
Again, sometimes I need to get slapped in the face with this stuff to really and that certainly did that. So, but anyway, wherever the Rolling Stones start to fall off, I'm not sure where that is, but it's certainly not with this record. This is great. I really enjoyed this.
Probably Steel Wheels, I think, is when
So all their 80s output, because Steel Wheels was late 80s. There's a lot of albums.
Tattoo You is 81, and I'll stand by Tattoo You. There's a
Steel Wheels is 89.
There. Yeah, 81 I think is Tattoo You. Then they kind of don't.
Goat's Head Soup is in there somewhere.
No, that's 70s. That's 70s.
Yeah,
it is. Okay.
So
no, because remember they don't get along for a while, Keith and Mick, and they don't make music. That's when Mick's dancing with David Bowie. Which, by the way, mashups. Are you familiar with the YouTube thing where they do mashups where they take all the music out and they just redo videos and just put found sound in it?
I think I've seen a couple of those.
Oh my god, the best one ever is David Bowie and Mick Jagger dancing in the street, and they just redo the voices of what they're saying. I'll share it with you guys. It's fantastic. So continue.
So we last talked about the Rolling Stones on episode 11 of this season on Exile, which was 72, and then this album comes out in 78, and there's 4 albums in between Exile and this. So like Matt, I kind of stopped thinking about the Stones after Exile, because you always hear about Sticky Fingers and Exile being kind of the best of the best Stones albums, or where you should start that and Let It Bleed, and that's all late 60s, early 70s. So I did not know this album as well, and I only knew the Miss You and Beasts of Burden and Shattered, which are the singles, right? I think. And so I was pleasantly surprised. Because it had been so long since we listened to the Stones, it was like a reminder of how good they are, right? It was refreshing to hear them again, and it reminded me of what they do differently and better than other rock bands that we've listened to, because they are not like Led Zeppelin, right? Led Zeppelin is much harder and kind of different, and they're more incorporating of folk, and Jimmy Page is such a strong influence. Rolling Stones are much more indebted, I think, to classic blues, and they have a slower tempo and a bit more kind of rollicking honky tonk feel to them for more or less. And I had forgotten that sound, and as you said, or one of you said, we've covered all these other different types of music and these burgeoning genres, like punk, and now we're seeing new wave, but also, we talked about Saturday Night Fever, and we've talked about, so many, all the black artists that we talked about, and Parliament, and Funkadelic, and Sly and the Family Stone, and the R&B and everything, right? All this stuff, and the Stones were there early on in the 70s, and now they're back, and they still got it. I also really enjoyed this album. It was just a fun listen. You can hear kind of the Chuck Berry influence on this album. he influenced like every band, but especially on something like Respectable, it reminds me of those days of Chuck Berry records, and these they have these up-tempo blues beats, and they still go to that country side of them again on this with Faraway Lies, and they are not afraid to be themselves and kind of like jam out in a blues way while also still incorporating these kind of new things, right? There's saxophone on Miss You, and like you said, there's a bit more of like a dance beat and maybe some punk influence as well. And I mean, it's kind of the Rolling Stones, I think on some level, because they're so good at what they do, you kind of like take them for granted in a certain way, or it's like hard to define like what makes them special. And I think when they have made so many albums and so many of them have been of high quality, it's easy to forget like what's special about them. And I feel like this reminded me of what we heard in the 60s and early 70s about what makes them good. And I'm now curious as to what those albums that we missed in the 70s that we didn't cover, like Goat's Head Soup and It's Only Rock and Roll, Black and Blue, and Love You Live. I guess it's probably a live album, but
we didn't get Angie, and we didn't get She's So Cold. So that's two of my favorite 70s Rolling Stones songs. Emotional Rescue was left out of that, right? So yeah, there were some.
So,
but I also like how they did like the. I did listen to and this is back in the '60s, but the Satanic Majesty's Request, even though it's kind of ridiculous, they still try to do something different. Even though they're at their core a blues rock band, there are still elements that they've done either with entire albums or with songs like a country type thing, or like a little bit more funk that they can expand a little bit and be interesting. I think so.
Yeah. This, I guess my point is that this album is not revolutionary, especially for the Stones, but it's just like a really solid album. And I wouldn't fault anyone that would say, this is like, I don't know if this was their favorite Stones album. I guess I could, accept that. It's up there, I think, in terms of their better albums. Also, I would say that the album art is really, really funny and cool as well. If you
their
seen
faces
that.
on girls' heads,
yeah. So they're not reinventing the wheel. I mean, they're still it's still Keith on guitar and Mick singing on lead. So it's not going to be some new iteration of them. But
you know what though,
good.
You don't need to, right? I think that sometimes it's that's certainly a criteria that we talk about, is about how something is groundbreaking or influential or this really amazing kind of artistic achievement. And then that's all well and good, and that's important, and I'm glad some of my favorite artists are like that. But this is just a reminder of how great just a basic rock and roll album can be. And that's one of the great things about classic rock and roll. That's what's the great thing about the Stones. It's just this R&B based blues rock is foundational, and it's great, and you can still try to do it and be not good at it.
How many bands
do a straight ahead album? That it just doesn't mean that that's automatically going to be good, but the Stones are the best at it, right? Nobody's done this type of rock and roll music to the extent that they've done it as well as they've done it,
how many bands can release a kick-ass album like this 15 years into their career too? Most bands are on fumes at 15 years, and the Stones were still churning out original albums they could tour off of 15 years in.
Especially in the late 70s.
I was about to say, even historically, but even for them, they were are they really the first band to get? I mean, because the Who are kind of tapering out at this point. Zeppelin hadn't really come till '69. The Beatles are long. I'm just trying to think of what other rock acts were at year 15 still churning out great original albums.
Yeah, not many.
Not really anybody. The Who is really the only group that you could say, and they're at the end of the road.
Yeah, and a lot of those bands in the '60s were might have had 1 or 2 albums. They didn't last long. They broke up or people died, right? Like Jim Morrison died in the early 70s, and
the Stones even had somebody who died, and it didn't matter. They just kept on.
But he also died after he got kicked out, right? I mean, so you can't carry on the Doors without Jim Morrison. It's just not going to happen. So, if that would have happened to Mick or Keith, that might have been something different. But,
unless they found like a Filipino singer who could imitate Jim Morrison like Journey, right? So but this is an awesome one. Go get it if you're not familiar with this era of the Stones. It's good. I'm glad my co-hosts were able to discover this album too, because I've long liked this album. It's good. That's why I put it on here, because it wasn't on any of the charts, which is kind of remarkable when you think about it. So.